So now we come to evolution itself, biological evolution, Darwinian evolution, or the succession to Darwinian evolution. And the first point is that it's faith. There's one, Matthews, is a fellow of the Royal Society. He wrote an introduction to Darwin's Origin of Species. So he said, the fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in a peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. So this is a scientist writing about evolution. Actually, it's self-evident that living beings have been created. For example, Sir Isaac Newton, he writes, how came the bodies of animals to be contrived with so much art? And for what purposes were their several parts? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics? And the ear without knowledge of sounds? And these things being rightly concluded, does it not appear from phenomena that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, omnipresent? This is Isaac Newton. I mean, a very, very great intelligence. Now, we can say that modern scientists are not so gullible as this, but actually they also accept the same conclusion, they just don't accept it. For example, Crick says, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So why do they have to constantly keep that in mind? Because it's not self-evident. What's self-evident is that they were designed. And what they have to keep reminding themselves is, no, it evolved. And Dawkins says, biology, Richard Dawkins, Thomas Huxley was known as the bulldog, Darwin's bulldog, because he championed Darwin's theory. So Dawkins has been called Darwin's Rottweiler. He's such a virulent critic of anything to do with faith, anything to do with religion. So he says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So in other words, right the way down, it's self-evident that actually evolution didn't take place. It's just a question of what you do with that, whether you accept the self-evidence or whether you go on the basis of, no, we can't accept faith, we can't accept religion, we can't accept creation because that's not an explanation. But the fact is that it's self-evident that design is self-evident. So what are the real objections? Now, this is some, one can say, okay, this is just polemic, creationists, they're at it again. What is the actual evidence? Is there any evidence against the theory of evolution? The propaganda is no, it's proven. Well, it's not proven. The first point is that evolution of species means that one species changes into another species. So the first point is that species don't change. Darwin knew that, but he was saying that, well, a breeder can change. Really, he said, it's like whatever he wants to produce, he can produce a breeder, which is not true. If you breed sheep, you don't end up with cows or horses. You end up with sheep. So he said that if a breeder can do that much in just a couple of 100 years, so what to speak of nature in millions of years? And then you can go, yeah, right. He can get your imagination going and you can see the constant procession of new forms and species. But the fact is, species don't change. There's been so much research now in the time since Darwin, and it's been established that species are stable entities, well, like categories. You can get some degree of variation, but the variations, the more you vary them, the less fit they are for survival, and then they just revert to type. So Darwin's theory relies on the fact that new variations appear which are more fit for survival than the previous ones. And so then gradually you get these new forms accumulating to produce new species which are more fit for survival than the original species that they came from. Which is not true, actually. Bacteria are doing really well. Bacteria are more fit for survival than human beings. So are cockroaches. Supposedly, if there was nuclear war, the only things that would survive would be cockroaches and rats. So it's not a fact that primitive forms of life are less fit for survival than so-called advanced forms of life. Species don't change. Darwin's finches Actually, they're variations. Recent observations have shown they're variations. When there's climatic changes in the Galapagos Islands, so then the species change, the populations change back. Breeding doesn't produce new species. And mutation also doesn't produce new species. There's been, bacteria, for example, which got a very, very short, the length of generation of bacteria is very short. So if there's going to be evolution, you'd see it in bacteria, but you don't. In so many years, 100 years of experimentation, they haven't produced one new species or even one new enzyme in bacteria. So species don't change. Yes, of course they don't change in real time, but in geological time they change. And we see in the fossil record, you've seen the dinosaurs, haven't you? But the fact is that the fossil record doesn't show species changing. Darwin knew that. And he said that this is because the geological record is very poor. But he predicted that as more and more research was done on the fossil record, they would be able to fill in the gaps and make a line of intermediate forms. But actually that hasn't happened. And it's clear now what is the form of the evidence in the fossil record, that you get a species, it'll remain in the fossil record unchanged, more or less unchanged, and then a new species comes in. No links. And then another new species comes in. So the fossil record also clearly shows that species don't change. So then where's the possibility of evolution? Evolution then is completely removed from direct experience. It's a myth. The process of evolution is a myth. It's something that people believe in, but they've never seen it. There's no direct evidence. Like supposing, for example, somebody's accused of a crime. He's got a motive. His character is very bad. Everything points to the fact that he is the person who performed it. He did the murder. There's only one little problem. At the time that the crime was committed, he was in court on a traffic offence. He's got a perfect alibi. So then where's the question of his having committed the crime? You have to accept the direct evidence. It doesn't matter the fact that he's got a bad character, the fact that he's got a motive. This is indirect evidence. So similarly with evolution, the direct fact is that species don't change. So then where's the question of evolution having taken place? They're trying to prove that physical changes produced organisms which are capable of generating non-physical information. Physical changes have produced organisms which can create artificial objects which have characteristics, which are outside. It's not possible that physical laws produce them. Physical laws, according to them, produce human beings. Human beings create skyscrapers. But the physical laws can't produce skyscrapers. There's a gap in the logic there. Very serious gap in the logic. We see that a body holds together for 50 years or 80 years or 100 years. It doesn't break down. The moment you die, it begins to decay. What happens with a tree? Now, a tree, a lot of the body of the tree is composed of cellulose. Cellulose is a stable compound. So when the tree dies, the tree trunk remains, and you can use it wood. You can use it for fire. What happens when you put it on the fire? It burns. Why does it burn? Because the cellulose is a high-energy compound, and when it burns, it breaks down to give low-energy compounds like carbon dioxide and ash, and the energy is released. So similarly, the body, a human body, it's not made of cellulose, so it's not stable. It begins to break down and stink after a short period of time, and that's why we have to one of the reasons why we have to dispose of the body. So the body is composed of high energy compounds which inconceivably remain in a stable operational state as long as life is within the body, and the moment you die, these compounds break down. In other words, the human body, or any living body, is not just a physical assemblage. There's laws of matter and laws of life. The Nobel laureate, Nobel biologist, Albert Szent-Györgyi, he was a Hungarian biologist. So he said, life is a revolt against the statistical laws of physics. And death means that the revolt subsided and the statistical laws resumed their sway. So there's laws of life and laws of matter. It's obvious. It's so clear to anybody but a Nobel evolutionist. It's so clear that the physical laws don't produce bodies which disobey the physical laws. So the whole concept of evolution it's irrational. It's completely irrational. What else? The fossil record. There's no gradual development of species. So this is all science. This is not something I've made up. All the paleontologists accept that. The sudden appearance of families with many, many different types. According to what Darwin said was that you should see a gradual development. He said if any new family appeared already fully developed with many different members, then that would refute my theory. Well, that's what happens, especially in the Cambrian explosion. This is the base of the fossil record. Before the Cambrian period, you have a very sparse fossil record, just soft-bodied, like worms, sponges, and like that. Jellyfish, not even sponges. And then suddenly, within 5 to 10 million years, all the phyla which are present on the Earth at the moment, they all appear. With fully developed, many different branches. And the evolutionists accept that it looks like creation. For example, Ward. And he says, if ever there was evidence suggesting divine creation, surely the Precambrian and Cambrian transition, known from numerous localities across the face of the Earth, is it. And Dawkins also, Richard Dawkins, he says there's two schools of evolution. There's those who believe that it must have happened gradually, and those who believe that it happened in jumps. I'll come to that in a minute. He says, anyway, both schools of thought agree that the only alternative explanation of the sudden appearance of so many complex animal types in the Cambrian era is divine creation. And both would reject this alternative. So, this is another, it's complete mystery. Paleontologists admit that. It looks like creation. It looks as though there wasn't any evolutionary history. Now, another point is that we see fossil species remaining unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Almost all the flowering plants appear suddenly in the fossil record, and they continue without change in the fossil record. Many insects also, you find remains of insects, especially in amber. They haven't changed at all. There's no new types. Things like ginkgo tree, they've been for tens of millions of years. And you go right down to crinoids and the nautilus for 200 million years without change. So where's the question of evolution? Another point is that there's no time for gradual evolution. For example, in the appearance of the mammals, there's no time, according to the fossil record, for gradual evolution to have taken place. Similarly, at the Cambrian explosion, again, there's no time for gradual evolution. 5 million years doesn't produce massive, hard-bodied invertebrates from jellyfish. So the alternative that many evolutionists have come up with is evolution by saltation, jumps. So they talk about hopeful monsters, that by a systemic genetic mutation you get something completely different appearing. There's no gradual change, but radical changes appearing. Now, first of all, mutations we've seen, they don't take place. Beneficial mutations don't take place. First of all, mutation doesn't produce new species, and beneficial mutations that don't exist. But then also, you've got to have not just one freak, but you've got to have two freaks that are going to mate and produce a new line. This is not a myth. So there's a real problem. There's no time for gradual evolution, and there's no other mechanism. Now then, there's a question of evolution by genetic mutation. This is another myth. the genes, supposedly, the genes control biological form. Obviously they do to some extent, but whether that's complete or not, that's another question. Now, the myth is that genes mutate, maybe by some fault. They're zapped by radiation or whatever, and they produce new forms. Now, first thing is, the gene is a message, it's information. And when you destroy or you alter information, you don't get better information. And actually, for example, as Marcel Schutzenberger in Paris, he did continued experiments to find out if you could change by chance variation of computer programs, you can produce a better program. And of course you don't. They don't work. He said, the odds of this happening is worse than 10 with 1,000 zeros. So we're outside the limit of conceivability again. Mutations, first thing is, mutations can't produce something beneficial because it's information. And physical laws break down information, they don't create new information. Second thing is mutations doesn't produce new forms. And the third thing is that mutations are consistently less fit for survival. And then another point is that all species are constantly mutating. The mutations are going on, but it doesn't produce new biological form. So, for example, Nautilus, which has gone unchanged for 200 million years, they're also mutating. Their genes are mutating, but no new biological form. So the idea that mutation of genes produces new biological form, it's a myth. This is another myth. Then, coming right up to the key point, are we descended from the apes? So all the evidence shows that actually there's no evidence to show that we are. Again, Schutzenberger, he's talking about human evolution. He said, how come in such a short period of time human beings could acquire so many new gifts like civilization, the opposed thumb, the ability to stand upright, like these things? He says, the reality is that we're confronted with total conceptual bankruptcy. Now, what about the evidence? Henry Gee, he's editor of Nature. He was talking about the evolutionary schemes of human evolution. He says it's a completely human invention, created after the fact, shaped to accord with human prejudices. And he says it's got no more validity than a bedtime story. This is amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. He's editor of Nature, very responsible scientist. So, just very briefly, their theory of evolution is, the theory of evolution from the apes, that you get apes, and then you get the ape men, like Australopithecus, and you get these pictures with these guys with gigantic eyebrows, staring out thoughtfully and hairily over the landscape. And then they give rise to Homo habilis, which is a kind of pre-human hominoid, and then you get Homo sapiens. But actually the fact is completely different. Australopithecus is not an ape man, it's an ape. They went on all fours, not standing upright. And they, by various anatomical clues, like the structure of the hip girdle, the structure of the feet, also the ears, they've shown that they're simply, and the teeth also, they're apes, they're not ape men at all. And constantly, when you come to Homo habilis, that's a human being. So there's no links between, on the one hand, the apes, and on the other hand, human beings. All of these, like the so-called humanoids, they're no more different from Homo sapiens than, say, the variations that you'd find between Eskimos, Bushmen, Caucasians, Australian Aborigines, Africans, and like that. They're just variations within a species. So the idea of human evolution, basically, it's another myth. Evolution from the apes. And one point, very telltale point, is that although their idea is that human beings evolved in the last 500,000 years, but actually there's a lot of evidence for Homo sapiens far further back. For example, there was a skull, they found a skull 800,000 years old, human skull. They found human footprints 3.6 million years old. And Cremo and Thompson they did very, very extensive research, and they produced this huge book called Forbidden Archaeology. So, Forbidden Archaeology, Forbidden Human Archaeology. And they showed that there's been a systematic cover-up. There's masses of evidence of human remains going back at least several tens of millions of years. But the scientific community does not accept it. Not only they don't accept it, they cover it up. And anyone, like for example, there's one or two cases they put forward. People who've tried to push forward this, they've found themselves outside the scientific community, dismissed from their jobs, not able to publish. In other words, the myth of scientific advancement is that whenever there's an improvement of present knowledge, so that's accepted and the knowledge actually improves gradually, but actually that's not what happens. There's a definite belief that this is our paradigm. And anything which contradicts the paradigm, like for example parapsychology or human remains from extreme antiquity, it's just admitted. It couldn't be true. How could it possibly be true? So it's dismissed, and in this way the status quo is preserved. So the actual fact is that the scientific community is bent on maintaining the status quo and accepting slight variations rather than admitting anything which radically contradicts their paradigm. So that's why it's interesting to, although there's so much common sense, logic, philosophy, and evidence contradicting the idea of evolution, but still they blunder on in the same way, accepting the same outmoded ways of thought, believing in something they don't know what it is. Evolution is a myth, and the theory of evolution is also a myth. Nobody's seen evolution, and nobody has ever seen a scientific theory of evolution. There isn't one. They can't say what changed into what. They can't say what the mechanism is. Nothing. It's just a belief, pure and simple. So, actually, if you examine the evidence, it's clear that biological organisms are produced by inconceivable potency. And that supports our theory of empirical frustration.